Today we're going to talk about the skeleton. And the skeleton, we can really break it down into two parts. The axial skeleton, which runs along the axis, and the appendicular skeleton. And things that are appendicular, they hang. So things like arms, legs, these are appendages. And so the bones of the arms and the legs, the shoulders, and the hips are appendicular. So first we're going to look at the axial skeleton. And before I do that, I'll go ahead and put this guy's arms back on, at least show you how they fit on here. And then we're going to look at the breakdown of what's in each part of the skeleton. So we'll start with the axial skeleton. We'll start with the skull. And we'll give you the overview of the skull. We'll go over the bones of the skull in just a moment. But the skull is one part of the axial skeleton. Then we have the vertebral column. And there are 24 vertebrae in the vertebral column. And we have 7 vertebrae that are called cervical vertebrae. 7 cervical vertebrae. These are the vertebrae of the neck. And so we have an easy way to remember how many there are. We have 7, and you can think of breakfast at 7. And then we've got 12 thoracic vertebrae. And you can immediately recognize them because they all have ribs attached. So our 12 thoracic vertebrae all have ribs attached. So you can remember that there are 12 of them because there's lunch at 12, right? And finally, we have our 5 lumbar vertebrae, and these tend to have some of the thickest vertebral bodies, this front part here, because they're supporting most of the weight of the torso. So this is the vertebral column, and we can remember the 5 lumbar vertebrae with our acronym dinner at 5. So we got breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, and dinner at 5. Then we have this bone right here called the sacrum. And the sacrum is part of the pelvis, but it's also part of the axial skeleton. So the rest of the pelvis, including the coccyx bones, which we'll talk about in just a moment, is part of the appendicular skeleton. So now let's look at this pelvis here, and we can see that we have our sacrum, which in development was 5 fused bones, and now they fused together to make this piece right here. And attached to the sacrum, we have the coccyx. And the coccyx also is comprised of, in most individuals, 2 to 3 bones that have fused together to form this piece. So the sacrum and the coccyx are continuous, and they form the inferior-most portion of the axial skeleton. Next, we're going to look at the skull. And the skull is the superior-most part of the axial skeleton. We have this part here, which is the cranial vault, and that is the part which contains our cranial cavity, and we would have the brain inside of here. So we'll start with the cranial vault, and we'll start with some of these bones. We have the frontal bone, which not surprisingly takes up most of the forehead, and is this part right here. On either side of the skull, we have these parietal bones here. There's a parietal bone on the left hand and a parietal on the right hand side. Then we have the occipital bone, which is not only the back of the head, but forms a good portion of the underside of the skull as well. And we have a major landmark in the occipital bone. We have the foramen magnum, which is where the spinal cord comes through. So this is our occipital bone, and it's a good part of the underside of the skull and the back of the head. Now you'll notice these joints here between a lot of bones. These are sutures, and sutures are basically cartilaginous joints that anatomists thought resembled stitches, so they called them sutures, which meant stitches, or sewing, it meant sewing. So these sutures are very good landmarks so that you can delineate the different bones. So frontal, parietal, occipital, and then if we look a little bit lower here, we have our temporal bone right here. And this is our temporal bone. We've got this nice landmark right here. That's called the external acoustic meatus, because this is where you have the entrance to your ear. So this is a good landmark for the temporal bone, which also has a good portion of it here on the undersurface of the skull. Now we also have, continuing on with the bones in the front of the skull, we have the 2 cheekbones here, which are called zygomatic bones. And indeed, the cheekbones, the zygomatic bones, along with the temporal bone, form this thing called the zygomatic arch. So the zygomatic arch is formed by processes both from the zygomatic bone and the temporal bone that make this zygomatic arch right here. Now we can also see the maxilla, which is this bone right here. So this is the maxilla. And this has the teeth of the upper jaw in it. We also have the mandible, which is the lower jaw. Hello. All right, now we can look at some of the bones on the inside of the skull. You can see some of them on the exterior surface of the skull too, but I'll go ahead and show you some of the major bones on the inside of the skull. So you see this kind of butterfly wing shape here, bat wing shape. This is called the sphenoid bone. You can see part of the sphenoid bone on the outside of the skull too, where I have my finger here. This is part of the sphenoid bone. You can see some of this is part of the sphenoid bone. It's quite interesting in its three-dimensional shape if we were to take it out of the skull, which I can't do on this model. But you can see most often you'll be asked to identify it from the inside, and it's this very prominent wing shape right here. In the middle of it, it has this landmark that looks like a saddle. Indeed, because of its resemblance to a saddle, it is called the Turkish saddle. So if you've ever seen a Turkish saddle, it looks a lot like that. Now let's look at the ethmoid bone, which is this bone right here above it. So this is the ethmoid bone right here. And it's got this prominent feature right here, and it sticks out. That's called the Crista Galli, and I just mention it because it's a very good landmark. Now you can see part of the ethmoid bone from the outside of the skull too. Here in the orbits of the eye, you can actually see part of the ethmoid bone. Right in front of it, you have this bone right here, and this is called the lacrimal bone. And you can see here you have a little hole there, and that's called the lacrimal fossa, and it's where tears are washed. Tears typically are manufactured up here by tear glands that are up here, and then they wash medially, inferiorly to this little passageway right here. And so you can immediately recognize the lacrimal bone, and lacrimose means sad or tearful, and you can recognize this lacrimal bone right here because of this little hole in it. We also have the nasal bone, and the nasal bone is this part right here. So this bridge of the nose is the nasal bone. And there's another part of the ethmoid bone right here. And if we look at the bottom part of the nasal cavity here, you can actually see this triangular bone called the vomer. And it will be continuous with the ethmoid bone, but the vomer is right here. And you can see that this is sort of a triangular shape here. It sits within the front and lower part of the nasal cavity and is continuous with the ethmoid bone of our nasal area here. All right, now let's look at the bottom of the skull here. And this piece right here is still part of the maxilla. But when we get to this part right here, this is called the palatine bone. So this part right here, the most posterior part of the roof of the mouth here, is the palatine bone right there. So that is the palatine bone that is continuous with the inferior portion or surface of the maxilla. One last bone that's often included with the axial skeleton, but is actually not connected to any other bone in the body, is this bone, the hyoid bone. And it's found in the throat. And on the skeleton, they sort of attached it to the front of the cervical vertebrae here just because they had no other place to put it. And it would really be about here somewhere. And your tongue would be attached to this bone. And it's a prominent part of the throat. So here we have our larynx. This is our hyoid bone in our larger-than-life model. And this also shows vocal cords and the epiglottis. and it shows the thyroid gland and part of the trachea, but you can see basically the location of the hyoid bone with respect to other parts of the throat. And this is also a bone that often forensic specialists are interested in because it can be broken if someone has had any kind of manual asphyxiation. So if somebody is suddenly choked, or somebody gets a hold of this thing like this, they can crush it. It also can be injured sometimes in sports. If somebody gets kicked in the throat or that kind of thing, you can see some damage to this hyoid bone.